Hey everyone. Tonight, we're entering the story of a man who should never have been famous, and yet became the shadow at the heart of Israel's greatest intelligence failure. For decades, Mossad was considered untouchable, a machine that saw everything before it happened. But in October 1973, it was blindsided, and standing in the middle of that blindness was one man, a double life, a whispered name, Ashraf Marwan. To some, a savior. To others, the traitor who helped bring Israel to the brink. Before we get into it, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Only if you genuinely love stories from the hidden corners of history. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing who's awake with these mysteries, night after night, all across the world. Now, settle in. Let your thoughts slow down. Tonight, we're traveling back to the afternoon of Yom Kippur, 1973. When silence filled the streets of Israel, prayers rose in the synagogues, and Mossad, the all-seeing eye, failed to see the war that was already at its gates. The city was still. It was the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, and Tel Aviv lay under a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. The streets were deserted, shutters pulled down, radios dark except for faint murmurs of prayer. In this hush, time itself seemed suspended, until a payphone half a continent away rattled its bell in a dim London corner. The metallic ring sounded ordinary to anyone passing by, but to the man waiting for it, it was an alarm bell from another world. He answered, a name exchanged in a whisper that won't be revealed yet, and then a number, a precise hour, passed like a code that could alter the fate of the nation. The words landed not with drama, but with clinical quiet. War was coming, and it would not wait for Israel's assumptions. Back in Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Golda Meir sat in a dimly lit room, the shadows of fatigue and worry etched across her face. A clock's second hand ticked forward, each click loud in the stillness. At 1:59, it seemed the entire country held its breath, unaware. At 2 o'clock, the first thunder shook the ground, not the rumble of weather, but artillery shells erupting from Egyptian batteries on the west bank of the Suez Canal, and Syrian barrages crashing into the Golan Heights. The war that was never supposed to happen had arrived exactly on time. 6 years earlier, Israel's intelligence services had been the masters of foresight. They had seen everything, mapped every weakness, turned shadows into certainty. In 1967, their watchfulness had delivered a victory so decisive it reshaped the region. But on this day, October 6th, 1973, they saw nothing. On this day, they were blindsided. Israel's most feared spy service had the warning. So, how did war still arrive on schedule? The answer begins not with the roar of artillery, but with the silence that followed victory. After the Six-Day War, Israel's triumph was absolute. In just under a week, in June 1967, Israel's forces had crushed Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, taking the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The victory was intoxicating, even existentially affirming. Surrounded by enemies who had vowed annihilation, Israel had not only survived, but humiliated its foes. That triumph carried a psychological weight as heavy as any weapon, the belief that Israel could not be defeated. Inside Israel's intelligence corridors, this confidence hardened into what became known as the conceptia, the concept. It was more than just a working theory. It became dogma. Egypt and Syria, so the thinking went, would never launch a full-scale war unless they first acquired the means to neutralize Israel's air superiority. Without long-range bombers and advanced missile systems, any Arab offensive would be suicidal, doomed to collapse as the Israeli Air Force swept the skies. The concept was neat, rational, reassuring. It meant that Israel's enemies would never dare attack until they reached a level of strength they did not yet have. It meant time was on Israel's side, and it meant that when signs of danger appeared, those signs would be filtered through this prism, bent until they fit the concept. Every satellite image, every intercepted conversation, every report from a field agent had to be measured against the doctrine. If it didn't fit, it was dismissed. Eli Zera, head of military intelligence, Amman, was one of the concept's most fervent guardians. He was a man of calculation and certainty, someone who believed in analytic clarity and the strength of precedent. Zaira insisted again and again that the Arabs would not attack. Their military weakness made it impossible. His voice carried weight in the cabinet rooms, his arguments backed by charts, probabilities, and what seemed like hard logic. On the other side of the intelligence sphere stood Zvi Zamir, the head of Mossad. Zamir was cautious, less wedded to the concept, but his service relied heavily on sources whose reliability was always questioned. Mossad prided itself on its human assets, men and women in the shadows of Cairo, Damascus, and beyond. One of these sources in particular, Ashraf Marwan, was a glittering jewel, feeding Israel insights into the highest levels of Egyptian decision-making. But even Marwan's warnings would be weighed against Zaira's cold calculus. Over them all loomed the political leadership, Prime Minister Golda Meir, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, and Chief of Staff David Dado Elazar. They were survivors of 1967, men and women whose reputations were forged in the fires of victory. The lessons of that triumph had sunk deep: bold preemption, ruthless air power, rapid mobilization. But victory had also carried its curse, the arrogance of invulnerability. To them, war was a storm they could predict, a tide they could manage. In the years after 1967, Egyptian forces conducted exercise after exercise along the Suez Canal. Their units moved equipment, erected bridges, practiced maneuvers that looked suspiciously like invasion drills. Each time Israel watched with a wary eye, and each time the concept ruled. These were not preparations for war, but gestures, threats, rehearsals designed to pressure and negotiate. Egypt wanted to frighten, to remind Israel of its presence, but it would never dare strike. The Air Force would smash them. The state would endure. The more these exercises repeated, the more they lost their sting. Familiarity breeds dismissal. When Syrian divisions massed on the Golan Heights in late September 1973, analysts at Amman reassured themselves, just another drill, another piece of political theater. When Egyptian forces moved bridging equipment and heavy artillery to the canal line, the conclusion was already written: exercises, nothing more. "The map is wrong, but it feels right," an officer joked once, tapping the concept diagram. On the map, Israel's intelligence lines stretched like nerves across the Arab world, feeding into a brain that seemed omniscient. But the map itself was a kind of blindness, a neat model that hid the chaos of reality. This blindness had a psychological root as well. The trauma of 1967 had not been just for the Arabs. Israelis too carried the scars of those desperate days before their surprise victory, when annihilation seemed possible. That trauma had been buried under triumph, but it lived on, shaping attitudes in subtle ways. For some, the overwhelming victory became a shield, proof that survival was guaranteed, that fear was no longer necessary. For others, it bred a compulsion to believe in warning systems, in the certainty that intelligence would never allow surprise again. Either way, arrogance crept in, disguised as confidence. The mechanics of this arrogance were subtle, almost invisible. In the conference rooms of Amman, dissenting voices were heard but softened, smoothed away by consensus. Analysts who questioned the concept were gently sidelined, their doubts reframed as overcaution. Reports that hinted at danger were reinterpreted until they aligned with doctrine. The system itself rewarded confirmation, punished deviation. Intelligence became not a search for truth, but a defense of the concept. This is how estimates become doctrine, how doctrine becomes dogma, and how dogma blinds. A warning system that once saved the nation in 1967 had turned inward, serving itself instead of the truth. In the fall of 1973, this blindness grew even more dangerous. Egypt had rebuilt its army, infused with Soviet weapons and advisors. President Anwar Sadat had a plan, not to conquer Israel outright, but to break the stalemate, to reclaim honor, to shatter the notion of Israeli invulnerability. He didn't need to destroy Israel. He needed only to wound it badly enough to force negotiation. He knew that Israel's intelligence believed in the concept, and he meant to use that belief against them. Syria, too, under Hafez al-Assad, prepared in silence. Together, Egypt and Syria orchestrated their greatest deception, a war disguised as an exercise. They massed troops, moved equipment, launched maneuvers, all under the cover of routine. Israeli eyes watched, reported, analyzed, and dismissed. The map was wrong, but it felt right. The silence of Yom Kippur 1973 was deceptive too. For weeks, signs had been mounting, but the rhythm of dismissal carried on. In late September, Israeli intelligence saw the Soviets evacuating their families from Cairo and Damascus. An ominous sign, but Amman's interpretation was simple. The Soviets feared escalation from exercises, nothing more. When Egypt called up its reserves, when Syria positioned its armor, when bridging equipment stacked by the canal grew too heavy to ignore, the interpretation stayed the same. The concept was intact. But intelligence is not destroyed by absence of data. It is destroyed by certainty. The data was there, screaming louder each day. What was absent was the willingness to believe it. Inside Mossad, there were murmurs of doubt, whispers that something was different this time. Zvi Zamir, cautious by nature, felt unease, but even he was not ready to overturn the consensus. To sound the alarm too often is to risk being ignored when it matters. Better to wait, better to be sure. Yet, war does not wait for doctrine, and certainty is not safety. As September turned to October, the Arab forces completed their preparations. The exercises were no longer rehearsal, but camouflage. Sadat's decision was made. Assad's forces were in position. The war was set. And in London, a phone call was placed. It carried a name, a time, and a warning so precise it should have shattered the concept. But even then, disbelief clung stubbornly. If your doctrine predicts the future, one analyst once said, you stop looking for it. That was the danger, and that was how blindness was born. The phones would ring again soon, and the war would arrive exactly on schedule. In the quiet pulse of London's high society, where tuxedos brushed against sequined gowns and laughter clinked like crystal in Mayfair dining rooms, Ashraf Marwan moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to every world and yet to none. He was the son-in-law of Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's late president, and still its most mythic figure, and the trusted aide to Anwar Sadat, the successor who carried a quieter mask but far sharper ambitions. In London, Marwan was a fixture, his presence confirmed by the whispers of hostesses, his wealth obvious in the tailored suits, the choice wines, the apartments where curtains never seemed fully closed. But beneath the sheen of effortless glamour, he lived like a man haunted by an invisible debt. Each smile weighed against the danger of betrayal, each whispered phone call rehearsed in his mind before it left his lips. He was the angel, the prized informant, whose secrets flowed into Tel Aviv like water through a hidden spring, and yet no one, least of all himself, could quite say why he was doing it, or where his true loyalty lay. Mossad had learned to listen to him as if he were scripture. His information arrived in carefully measured doses, enough to prove he knew the inner sanctums of Egyptian decision-making, enough to make men in Tel Aviv lean forward over maps and nod with satisfaction. When he first appeared years before the Yom Kippur War, his intelligence was almost too sharp, too clean. Egypt's weapons orders, their Soviet connections, their diplomatic feints, it all flowed from Marwan. And while most agents stumbled, hesitated, made mistakes that revealed the edges of their access, Marwan's files read like precision-cut diamonds, every facet gleaming, every angle perfect. That perfection was intoxicating and dangerous. For intelligence officers, nothing is more unsettling than a source who never slips, who never doubts, who never lies poorly. The angel's perfection forced a question that none of them could quite voice without undermining the very foundation of Israel's security. What if this man was not a gift, but a trap? Still, suspicion bent under the weight of results. In Tel Aviv, generals would hold up Marwan's reports and say, "Here, finally, was the proof that Israel's enemies could be known before they struck." His access to Sadat was undeniable, his proximity to Egypt's war rooms impossible to counterfeit. And so, over the years, each successful prediction dulled the edge of caution. Mossad officers told themselves that even if he had a hidden agenda, the sheer depth of his knowledge outweighed the risks. Better to risk being manipulated than to discard the one man who seemed to hold a candle inside the darkened hallways of Cairo. But even as they clung to his intelligence, the angel lived with the silence that stalks all double lives. He walked through London hotels where the corridors seemed endless and hushed, every shadow possibly concealing the very people he was betraying. He carried his secrets like a second skin. Each knock on a door could be Mossad, or Egyptian intelligence, or a stranger who knew too much. The loneliness of that existence etched itself into him. At dinners, when he raised a glass in toast, he alone knew that his true conversation would take place later, perhaps in a parked car on a quiet street, perhaps in a hotel room with curtains drawn and voices lowered to whispers. Every word he offered Mossad was weighed against the possibility of discovery. One phrase said in the wrong accent, one glance caught by the wrong pair of eyes, and he would be dead. Not figuratively, not career dead, but quite literally silenced, his body found in some ditch outside Cairo, or never found at all. And yet, he continued, he refined his methods, embraced the old techniques of Humant with a precision that was almost theatrical. He used cutouts, layers of distance, so that his identity remained shielded until the very last moment. He agreed to meetings only when the urgency outweighed the risk, and even then, only at the final hour, forcing Mossad handlers into frenzied improvisation. He would signal through the smallest of gestures, a call made under a prearranged code, a message slipped beneath a hotel room door, a note slid silently across a table. Tradecraft became his heartbeat, his silent prayer. Every agent lives with fear, but only the best learn to mask it beneath normality, to turn the act of surviving into something resembling calm. It was in 1973, in the months leading up to October, that the angel's silence became as dangerous as his words. Twice that year, his warnings had been sounded. Egypt was mobilizing. War was imminent. Action was required. And twice, those warnings had ended in false starts. Armies moving and then retreating. Operations postponed. Dates shifted. Each time Israel responded with vigilance, preparing, bracing, watching the borders, and each time the wave broke on nothing. The warnings dulled nerves, eroded urgency. In Tel Aviv, decision-makers began to whisper, perhaps Egypt had no real intention of attacking. Perhaps Sadat's moves were all theater, bluff without substance. Perhaps even the angel, as brilliant as he was being misled or feeding them shadows. Each false alarm carved a groove into the psyche of Israeli leadership, a groove that, by October, had hardened into dangerous certainty. Egypt would not dare, not now, not this year. The angel felt the weight of that certainty pressing against him. For all his wealth, all his glittering presence in London, he was alone in that knowledge. He alone could see the outlines of what was coming. He carried the fear that his reports were losing force, that the men in Tel Aviv were no longer listening with the same desperate intensity. And so, as Yom Kippur approached, he moved with increasing urgency. In the silent hotel corridors of London, a message card slid beneath a door. A knock at midnight, unexpected, summoning a Mossad officer from sleep to a meeting that could not be delayed. The angel had a warning, urgent and absolute. War was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. The timing was not months away, not weeks. It was days, perhaps hours. Imagine the handler standing in the half-light of a London hotel room, listening to Marwan's voice, steady but urgent, the weight of inevitability pressing into each word. Imagine the pause after he finished speaking, the silence that lingered because even as the Mossad officer heard the words, he could not shake the memory of the earlier false alarms. Trust had been dulled, and doubt crept in. And yet, something in the angel's urgency was different this time. Something in his eyes, in the way he leaned closer, in the quiet tone of a man who understood the danger of every syllable he spoke, suggested this was no bluff. This was the moment everything had been leading to. And still, hovering above it all, like a specter neither man could dispel, was the question that no one dared to answer. What if this man was too perfect? What if his access, his precision, his flawless tradecraft were not signs of loyalty, but of design? What if Israel's most prized informant was not their salvation, but Cairo's most brilliant deception? That possibility lingered in the back of every mind, whispered but never resolved, because to question it was to risk paralysis at the very moment when action was most needed. As dawn approached, the urgency sharpened. Marwan insisted Sadat would strike, Syria would move in tandem, the war would begin with a blow as sudden as it was devastating. He pressed for Israel to heed his warning, to act, to prepare, for time had nearly run out. Hours before Yom Kippur, when Israel would be at its most vulnerable, when fasting and prayer would draw the nation into stillness, the angel's voice cut through the haze of doubt with one final plea for belief. He requested a meeting, urgent, immediate, not in weeks, but now, in London, in the hours before history would shatter. And so the stage was set. Mossad's greatest source had raised the alarm once more, but this time the stakes were different. This time, the silence of disbelief would mean catastrophe. This time, to dismiss him would be to invite the darkest kind of blindness. Yet, still, unanswered, unsolved, hovered the riddle of the angel. Was he Egypt's most reckless traitor, or its most brilliant weapon? The answer remained shrouded, suspended between trust and suspicion, as Mossad officers prepared for the urgent London meeting that would decide whether Israel stood ready or sleepwalked into disaster. The quiet before catastrophe is often the most deceptive of silences, and in the weeks leading up to October 1973, that silence was layered with noise carefully arranged to disguise its true meaning. It began as routine, or at least appeared that way, the same sort of movement Israel had catalogued so many times before. Egyptian divisions crossing the desert sands toward the canal in long convoys of dust, Syrian brigades shifting positions on the Golan Plateau, Soviet transports loading crates under the watchful eyes of embassy staff. The photographs came in daily, black and white frames of tanks aligned like chess pieces and soldiers hunched over field radios. Analysts pinned them to corkboards, drew circles, annotated margins, and then, almost in relief, added the word that had become a shield against panic: exercise. It was the word that dulled urgency, the word that transformed the smell of fuel and the clang of bridging gear on the Suez Canal into something less menacing, a phrase that explained everything and therefore required no action. For Israel's intelligence community, especially within Amman, this was the tyranny of the concept in motion. The concept held that neither Egypt nor Syria would dare attempt a full-scale war until they achieved a strategic parity with Israel, particularly in the air. As long as Israeli pilots dominated the skies, no Arab leader, so the reasoning went, would risk annihilation. This assumption had been tested and reaffirmed many times since 1967. Each mobilization, each round of war games on the canal's edge, each Syrian maneuver in the Golan, all had been explained away and then faded into memory. When Soviet advisors urged their families to leave Egypt in September, their hurried departures were noted, but softened by annotation, precaution. When pontoons and bridging equipment appeared in greater numbers than ever before, stacked like bones on the canal's banks, they were filed under training. Even when Egyptian units carried live ammunition in their drills, something seasoned analysts recognized as unusual, the notation remained the same: exercise. Yet there were those who could not quite silence the unease. One junior officer in Tel Aviv, scanning aerial shots late into the night, felt the stir of instinct that gnawed at reason. He leaned back, tapping his pencil against the desk, staring at the grainy images of Sager anti-tank teams positioning in shallow dunes. Something was wrong. But procedure dictated hierarchy, and hierarchy meant writing his observation in the margin before sliding the folder across to his superior. The man above him, a veteran, trusted, calm, read the note, raised an eyebrow, and after a moment's thought tapped his pen twice against the folder. File it. That sound, 2 dull taps against a wooden desk, was the muffled echo of a decision that would haunt the country in days to come. On the canal's western edge, Egyptian soldiers rehearsed under the blazing sun. They ferried bridging gear, laid out steel pontoons, and timed themselves in drills that looked, from afar, like theater. Engineers worked until sweat streaked their uniforms, shouting commands across the water. To the casual observer, it was impressive but unremarkable, part of the endless military choreography that had become background noise. But to those within Cairo's war rooms, this was the overture to a symphony of deception, every note calculated to appear familiar, every movement crafted to lull Israel into inaction. The very repetitiveness of the exercises became the deception. When you repeat something often enough, the watcher stops believing it could ever become real. Syria played its part with equal precision. On the Golan Heights, artillery batteries shifted positions, while armored units moved in patterns that mirrored prior maneuvers almost exactly. For the Israelis watching through long lenses, it seemed like more of the same. Syrian bluster, Syrian bravado, Syrian theater. Yet the patterns were not accidental. Damascus had studied its own past mobilizations, copying them deliberately so that when the real buildup came, it would be indistinguishable from what had come before. The enemy had learned the psychology of its watcher and was now using that knowledge to write the script of war. Inside Amman's offices, photographs and intercepted chatter stacked up in growing piles. Analysts noted increased Egyptian radio discipline, unusual silence where chatter should have been. Silence, they wrote, could mean discipline rather than intent. Elsewhere, conversations were intercepted about political tensions, about Sadat's need to pressure the Americans into re-engaging on peace talks. These, too, became annotations in the margins, political signaling. The machinery of denial and deception worked because it leaned on the very assumptions Israel had built its security upon. If you believed Egypt would not move without air parity, then every piece of evidence could be explained away as posturing, training, or bargaining. But there was one piece that did not fit so easily: the Soviets. Their advisors, present in Egypt for years, had begun to withdraw with unusual speed. Families were escorted to the airport, trunks packed, embassies unusually active. Pilots and technicians who had grown accustomed to life on the Nile suddenly vanished. To some, this looked like a red flare, a signal of something imminent. To others, it was merely a precaution against escalation, the Soviets unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of another limited clash. Again, the files were marked, cataloged, explained. In war, the danger often lies not in what you don't know, but in what you think you know for certain. Meanwhile, Mossad received its own fragmentary whispers. Station chiefs abroad sent notes of Egyptian mood shifts, subtle hints of urgency in conversations that once meandered. An informant in Europe spoke of unusual purchases of medical supplies. Another hinted at emergency stockpiles being moved closer to the front. Each report was isolated, hard to confirm, but together they formed a mosaic whose shape was becoming hard to ignore. Yet, the very existence of Ashraf Marwan, the angel, cast a long shadow over every report. If Marwan had not raised the alarm, could these fragments be trusted? If the most valuable source in Cairo remained calm, then what did it mean if the pieces suggested otherwise? Within this environment of uncertainty, denial, and overconfidence, the loneliness of those who doubted became acute. A handful of analysts felt the weight of their instincts pressing against the walls of the concept. They scribbled questions in margins, underlined unusual movements, whispered to each other in late-night corridors. But each time the hierarchy responded with that quiet, suffocating finality: file it. Their unease could not pierce the confidence that had calcified over years of false alarms. A false alarm costs readiness. Readiness costs credibility. Credibility is the lifeblood of intelligence. Better, they thought, to risk caution than to cry wolf again. But outside, in the darkness of Cairo's hotel corridors, another story was taking shape. A message card slid under a door in London carried more weight than the stacks of photographs pinned in Tel Aviv. A late-night knock echoed softly through a hotel hallway, a signal that words too dangerous for paper had to be spoken face to face. The angel had something to say. For weeks, his silence had been both reassuring and maddening. Now, suddenly, he asked for a meeting. The request was simple, but the timing was anything but. It was the cusp of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Israel, a time when families would retreat into prayer and silence, when soldiers would stand down, when the rhythm of a nation slowed to stillness. The message carried a coded urgency that could not be ignored. Tonight, London, come alone. Those words ignited a spark of dread in the hearts of those who read them. After months of doubt, after weeks of exercises that might not have been exercises at all, the angel was finally breaking his silence. The question that hovered in the air, unspoken but suffocating, was this: was this the warning that would save Israel, or the final act in a deception that would blind it? And so, as the folders in Tel Aviv were quietly filed away and the tapping of pens marked the rhythm of misjudgment, another scene was being prepared across the sea. The streets of London glistened with autumn rain, the corridors of hotels hummed with muffled footsteps, and one man's decision to pick up a phone and call Mossad set into motion a chain of events that would decide whether Israel would wake to another routine exercise or to the roar of an invasion. The meeting had been requested, the place chosen, and the message was clear: come tonight, come alone. What waited in that room was not merely intelligence. It was the thin line between warning and deception, between foresight and catastrophe. The rain in London had stopped just minutes before the black car slid up to the discreet hotel entrance, its headlights dimmed as though the night itself had instructed it to move unseen. Zvi Zamir, head of Mossad, stepped out without hesitation, coat collar turned up, carrying nothing that would identify him beyond a man traveling quietly on business. He had received the call only hours earlier, a terse instruction from the most valuable source Israel had ever run: come tonight, alone. In the shadow world of espionage, such summons were not made lightly, and Zamir knew at once what it meant. The drills across the canal, the tanks that refused to disappear, the eerie sense of performance on the Syrian front, all of it converged into the thinnest line between warning and catastrophe. But even Zamir, seasoned by years of double dealing and whispers traded in safe flats across Europe, felt the chill of the hour. The hotel lobby was hushed, its carpets muffling every sound, the receptionist deliberately inattentive, a performance rehearsed many times before. A bell chimed from somewhere deep inside as Zamir walked past, his shoes leaving barely a trace of sound. The source, Ashraf Marwan, son-in-law to Nasser, close confidant to Sadat, the man who could whisper the very thoughts of Egypt's high command into Israel's ear, was waiting upstairs. To Mossad he was known simply as the Angel, a code name that had taken on a mythology of its own inside the narrow corridors of Israeli intelligence. To Zamir, he was both the greatest gift and the most dangerous gamble Mossad had ever accepted. The room was heavy with smoke when he entered, as though Marwan had been trying to chain the nerves out of his body through one cigarette after another. The ashtray overflowed, a small mountain of burnt evidence of hesitation. The curtains were drawn tight against the city lights, and only a single lamp near the bed illuminated the scene in pale gold. Marwan did not stand, he merely raised his eyes, and the weight of history seemed to fall into the silence between them. He did not bother with pleasantries, nor with the elaborate conversational dances spies often used to guard against traps. He leaned forward, voice low, almost inaudible. "It is tomorrow. They will attack tomorrow." Zamir's breath slowed. It was not the words alone, it was the precision that followed them. Marwan gave the time, down to the hour. Around 6 in the evening, on Yom Kippur, coordinated strike from Egypt and Syria. The phrase hung like lead in the air. The angel had given plenty before, plans, strategies, indications, but this was different. This was no longer analysis nor prediction. This was a death sentence with a clock attached. For a long moment, Zamir said nothing. He only watched Marwan's face, measured the tremor in his hand as he stubbed out another cigarette, the cold resolve behind his eyes. Could this be deception? Was Marwan playing a double game, designed to lure Israel into costly, premature mobilization again? Zamir's mind reached back to May, only months earlier, when a flurry of false alarms had rattled the country, when tens of thousands of men had been pulled from their homes, economy slowed, streets filled with uniforms, and nothing had happened. The political cost of crying wolf again on the holiest day of the year would be immense, perhaps irreparable. Yet, if Marwan was right, hesitation would mean annihilation at the front lines. The clock on the nightstand ticked loudly, each second sounding like a footstep approaching from the dark hallway outside. Zamir leaned forward finally and asked the only question that mattered. "How certain are you?" Marwan did not flinch. 100%. The order has been given." He drew on another cigarette and exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the lamp. "This is not another exercise. By the time the prayers end tomorrow, the war will already be at your doorstep." It was the kind of whisper intelligence officers dream of and dread in equal measure. Too precise to ignore, too solitary to act upon without doubt. The concept, that rigid doctrine inside Amman, which insisted that Egypt would never move without air superiority, still hung over every evaluation back in Tel Aviv. And yet, here was the angel, trusted above all, putting his entire credibility on the line in this dimly lit room. Zamir left the hotel not long after, his mind pounding with the rhythm of the clock he had just heard ticking away the last hours of quiet. He did not sleep. The flight back to Tel Aviv seemed endless, the engines droning against the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. Somewhere below, in Europe's cities, people were dancing, eating, living through their ordinary nights. In Israel, synagogues would be preparing for the holiest silence of the year. And at the canal, Egyptian soldiers would be whispering their own final prayers before the floodgates opened. When he landed, he went straight into the secure rooms of Amman and the Prime Minister's circle. His words were urgent, his tone stripped of hesitation. "War is imminent, tomorrow, at 6 in the evening." The message, raw from Marwan's lips, was carried like a torch through the cold halls of analysis. Yet, even as it landed, skepticism flared. The senior officers of Amman, guardians of the concept, reminded each other that they had seen these maneuvers before. They pointed out that Marwan, though golden, was still one man. One man's whisper, however precise, could not overturn years of doctrine and reams of analysis. What if Egypt had calculated that Israel would trust him and had turned him into the perfect channel for deception? What if they mobilized and nothing happened, once again embarrassing themselves on the world stage and weakening deterrence? Golda Meir sat with her advisors, weighed down by the knowledge that ordering full mobilization meant disrupting the country on its most sacred day. Yom Kippur was not just another date on the calendar. It was the soul of the nation's rhythm, the day when the streets emptied, when radios fell silent, when the country seemed to breathe in unison. To call the reserves then was not only politically costly, but emotionally jarring. And yet in her mind, behind every argument, the voice of the Holocaust whispered, "You cannot afford to be wrong on the side of inaction." The debate stretched on through the night, each minute consumed by arguments of probability and risk. The analysts clung to patterns, insisted that no army would launch a war with such limited preparation, insisted that Egypt would never dare cross without the Air Force to cover them. But Zamir kept returning to the phrase Marwan had whispered, "Tomorrow, 6 o'clock." He replayed the sound of it, the certainty, the refusal to hedge. It did not sound like theater. It sounded like truth. Morning crept into Tel Aviv, pale and deceptive in its calm. The streets were quieter than usual, emptied of cars, filled only with the occasional figure walking toward a synagogue. In the defense ministry, the atmosphere was taut, the weight of decision pressing down with no release. Orders went out for partial mobilization, cautious steps designed to balance the warning with the fear of overreaction. But the hesitation would cost hours that Israel no longer possessed. By noon, fragments of confirmation began to trickle in. Unusual radio traffic on Egyptian channels. Unexplained silence in Syrian communications. Intercepts that suddenly stopped, as though the actors had left the stage and were moving into battle positions. The signals were faint, but unmistakable to those willing to see. And still, the doctrine pushed back, the memory of false alarms anchoring the decision-makers in place. At precisely 1 p.m, the phone on the operations desk rang with a jolt that cut through the silence. A hurried voice delivered the update that snapped the room awake. The timing had shifted. The attack would not wait until evening. The offensive was set for 2 o'clock, barely an hour away. The blood drained from faces. The whispered warning of Marwan, already fragile under doubt, now burned with urgency that could no longer be dismissed. Mobilization orders flew at last, but the time had evaporated. The synagogues of Israel remained filled with worshippers, the radio silent, as armored columns on the other side of the canal warmed their engines. And then, as the hands of the clock aligned at 2 p.m, the roar began. The thunder of artillery, the howl of aircraft, the surge of water cannons blasting at the sand barriers. The war had arrived, not at 6 as promised, but 4 hours earlier, slamming into Israel with the weight of surprise. The phones in Tel Aviv lit up, commanders shouting, orders colliding, confusion thick as smoke. The London whisper had been true, yet not precise enough to save the crucial hours. The angel had given them the day, but the hour, oh, the hour, had slipped just beyond reach. And Israel, blinded by its own belief in patterns and doctrines, found itself caught in the very nightmare it had sought to avoid. The scene cuts hard, without comfort, to the chaos of 2 o'clock, when silence shattered into fire. It begins with silence, so profound it feels unnatural, a silence that carries the weight of centuries, broken only by the murmured prayers of a people in synagogues across the land. On the holiest day, when streets are empty and radios quiet, when the nation folds into itself in ritual and reflection, the first tremor does not come from the earth or from the heavens, but from a vibration deep beneath the stillness of the desert. The ground quivers near the canal. Men in concrete bunkers look up, unsettled, then glance back down at their maps, their watches, their thermoses of cold tea. The clocks have not yet struck 2. Somewhere across the water, Egyptian soldiers lower their heads and brace, their commanders signaling in silence. And then the stillness of Yom Kippur is torn apart by the thunder of artillery. The shells rise in great arcs, black silhouettes against the midday sun, and fall with such precision that entire stretches of the Bar-Lev line disappear in smoke and fire. Fragmentary radio transmissions burst through static. One voice calls coordinates in a clipped whisper before the sound breaks into shrieks of interference. Then silence. Another, hoarse with disbelief, insists that thousands of Egyptian troops are already in rubber dinghies, racing across the canal under the cover of the barrage. In the bunkers, men cough in the choking dust, their ears ringing, their eyes unable to adjust to the sudden darkness. They press their heads to the radios, listening for instructions, for help, for anything at all, but what they hear is only chaos layered over chaos. The invulnerable wall that Israeli generals had once described as impenetrable is being torn open like paper. At the same moment, far to the north, the skies above the Golan Heights split with contrails as Syrian MiGs and Sukhois dart forward in deadly precision. Beneath them, hundreds of Syrian tanks roar toward the border, treads clattering over volcanic rock, their engines belching smoke that spreads across the fields like a black curtain. Israeli forward positions spot them and fire desperately, but it is like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. Artillery rains down, shells whistling past with shrieks that feel like banshees tearing through the air. In a matter of minutes, the horizon is crowded with advancing steel. The defenders scramble radios and cry out for reinforcements, but the answers come slow, confused, tangled in disbelief. No one can process that two fronts have exploded at once with such ferocity. It had always been assumed that the Arabs could not coordinate. That surprise of this magnitude was impossible. In the command rooms in Tel Aviv, the first reports pour in as fragments. Disconnected, so bizarre they are at first dismissed as exaggerations. But then the floodgates open, and the scale of the catastrophe becomes undeniable. Egyptian units are not only crossing the canal, but erecting pontoon bridges under the protective shield of an artillery barrage unlike anything Israel has faced since 1948. Engineers wielding high-pressure water cannons blast away at the mighty sand ramparts that Israeli planners once boasted would hold for decades. The great dunes crumble in minutes, walls collapsing into slurry under jets of water, and the proud Bar-Lev line is transformed into a graveyard for its defenders. At the Golan, Israeli tanks race forward in haste, their commanders confident that armored superiority will stop any breakthrough. But within minutes of engagement, confidence shatters. The first Sagar missiles streak across the battlefield, slow, almost lazy in flight, but deadly accurate. Tank crews, who had never faced such weapons, watch in horror as their comrades' machines erupt in flames. Entire armored platoons vanish, one missile after another carving through the vaunted Israeli steel. Survivors climb out of burning hulks, dazed, blinded, some screaming in disbelief that their invulnerable armor is no shield at all. For the first time since 1948, Israeli soldiers feel hunted, not any hunters. Above the southern front, pilots scramble their Phantoms and Skyhawks in desperate sorties to pound the Egyptian bridgeheads. They dive into walls of flak so dense it looks like a moving ceiling of black smoke. Then the surface-to-air missiles rise, SA-2S, SA-3S, SA-6S, layered in an umbrella so thick that one Israeli pilot later said it felt like flying into a cage made of fire. Radios crackle with terse shouts as missiles lock on. One plane explodes midair, fragments scattering over the desert. Another pilot manages to eject, but lands in the middle of Egyptian infantry, captured before he can even unbuckle his harness. Squadron after squadron reports losses. It is not a battle. It is a massacre. The very tactic Israel had always trusted, striking first from the skies, is suddenly suicidal. Moshe Dayan, who had built his career on projecting unshakable confidence, walks into the underground command bunker and hears the reports. He stares at the maps, at the red arrows spreading across them, at the frantic reports of casualties, at the words Bar-Lev breached, repeated again and again. His face tightens. For the first time in his long, celebrated career, he allows despair to seep into his voice. He mutters that the temple may fall, a phrase that chills everyone within earshot. For in Israel's fragile collective memory, that phrase is more than metaphor. It is the shadow of annihilation. On the home front, sirens wail across towns and cities, pulling civilians from their prayers into a nightmare they never imagined. Families rush to shelters, clutching children in their arms, hearts pounding in disbelief that war has come again on the very day of solemn peace. Radios in living rooms echo with confused bulletins, voices breaking as they try to maintain calm. But outside, the reality is written in contrails, in plumes of smoke rising on the horizons of both north and south. Ambulances scream through the streets, and people press transistor radios to their ears, desperate for any word that the army has regained control, but none comes. Instead, there are whispers of towns at risk, of borders collapsing, of soldiers isolated and cut off. Back on the lines, Israeli defenders in the sand bunkers of the Bar Lev radio their last positions before Egyptian infantry storm the walls. A commander whispers his coordinates, his voice barely audible. Then there is a burst of static and silence that lingers like a death knell. In the Golan, the fields are littered with burning tanks, the smell of scorched steel and cordite thick in the air, and Syrian armor pushes deeper and deeper. A young tank officer, stunned by the pace of collapse, mutters into his headset that if this is day 1, there might not be a day 3. His words travel through the network, repeated, reshaped, echoing in command posts until they become the unspoken fear of an entire nation. The intelligence failure is no longer an abstract mistake of interpretation or timing. It is bleeding on the battlefield. Every misjudged assumption manifests in fire and death. The belief that Egypt and Syria would never coordinate leads to simultaneous shock assaults. The confidence that Egyptian bridging was impossible collapses under the hiss of water cannons. The conviction that Israeli armor was invincible disintegrates under the precision of Soviet-made missiles in Arab hands. The assumption that the skies belonged to Israel is disproven with each pilot shot down. The wrong posture, the wrong maps, the wrong belief in deterrence, it all converges into catastrophe. As the sun sets on that first day, Israel teeters on the brink of something it has never faced before. Not a costly war, not a bloody engagement, but actual defeat. Commanders whisper in corners about fallback lines, about abandoning positions that had been deemed eternal. Civilians in shelters sing prayers not for victory, but for survival. And in the hearts of those who had grown up believing in Israel's military invincibility, a terrible new thought begins to spread. Die war story. If the country is not as strong as it always seemed, perhaps it is not as permanent as everyone believed. The silence that follows the night's barrage is not relief, but dread, because all know that the worst is still to come. The desert night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that makes a man hear the ticking of his own watch and wonder whether dawn will ever come. Inside the war cabinet, smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the bitter staleness of coffee that had long gone cold. Ashtrays overflowed, tempers flared, and the maps on the wall seemed less like guides and more like reminders of how little control anyone truly had. This was not strategy on paper anymore. It was survival, and survival had stripped away all illusions of certainty. The first 48 hours had shredded the myth of invincibility. Now came the reckoning. Men who had sworn that the Arabs would never dare attack now sat hunched forward, knuckles pressed into the table, debating whether Israel's only path forward might require abandoning its most sacred military taboo, preemption. But how do you preempt when you are already drowning? The irony clawed at every word spoken that night. The nation that had prided itself on foreseeing danger, on moving first and striking first, now found itself trapped in reaction, forced to relearn in real time the lessons it had smugly filed away as unnecessary. The generals whispered of depleted tank brigades and shattered air wings. Intelligence chiefs, their voices hoarse, admitted that their elaborate collection networks were blind and fragmented. In the corner, someone muttered a bitter truth, almost too quietly to be heard. We told ourselves a story. The war didn't care. That sentence hung in the air like a sentence passed down by history itself. The certainty of the past had died at the Suez Canal and on the slopes of the Golan. Now everything had to be rebuilt, not in months of analysis, not in polished estimates, but in hours under fire, with half the army still scrambling to even reach the front. And scramble they did. Reserve units poured toward staging grounds in civilian cars, in buses commandeered off highways, in trucks that still smelled of produce and dust. Some carried rifles without ammunition, helmets without liners, maps that had been printed for exercises, not wars. Commanders pieced together improvised battalions, inserting men into gaps left by the dead and the missing. Orders were scrawled on the back of cigarette packs, passed hand to hand as radios jammed or failed under the weight of chaos. This was no longer the tidy machine of lightning war. It was improvisation in its rawest form, an army learning on contact, bleeding as it learned. In Tel Aviv, intelligence officers tore apart their own assumptions. The elegant concept that had blinded them was now nothing more than a smoking ruin, and in its place they scrambled to stitch together reality from scraps of intercepted chatter, hastily captured prisoners, frantic phone calls from diplomats abroad. Collection assets were retasked, not in months or weeks, but in minutes, as though the entire intelligence apparatus had become a triage ward, trying to stabilize a patient that might not last the night. The game of deception, one that Israel had believed it mastered, now turned cruel. Egyptian units used dummy signals to lure Israeli airstrikes into empty desert, while Syrian armor switched channels, breaking up patterns that Israeli analysts once thought they could read like scripture. The hunters had become the hunted in the world of frequencies and static. To counter, officers created ad hoc red teams, small groups of young analysts ordered to think, not like Israelis but like Egyptians, like Syrians, to sketch out the moves their enemies would make if they held the initiative. It was desperate, makeshift, and dangerously thin, but it was something. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, phones rang deep into the night. Henry Kissinger, the chess master of diplomacy, listened with half-closed eyes as his aides whispered reports. He did not see Israel's tanks burning or its pilots ejected into the Sinai sands, but he understood the peril in abstract, cold terms. If Israel collapsed, the balance of power shifted overnight, and America would pay the price in the currency of influence, oil, and credibility. In whispered tones, he made promises that had not yet been cleared, hinting that the arsenal of the United States could and would be opened. For now, it was not planes on the runway, but words in the air, words meant to steady, words meant to buy time. Time was the one commodity Israel did not have. Every hour the Egyptian bridgehead widened, every hour Syrian artillery edged closer to the heart of the Galilee. The possibility of national catastrophe grew. Mobilization was now total, but it felt like patchwork, plugging holes in a dam that threatened to burst. Commanders who had spent years telling themselves that they would never fight on two fronts simultaneously now drove from Sinai to Golan in endless loops, their cars coated with dust, their eyes red with fatigue, their voices growing hollow from repeating the same urgent orders to men who looked no less broken than themselves. Still, in the midst of exhaustion, something began to stir. Not a plan, not yet, but an instinct, a rhythm of war that could only be rediscovered through pain. Tank crews who had been ambushed by Sagar missiles now learned to maneuver with smoke, to use terrain, to bait and then flank. Pilots who had watched their comrades vanish in explosions of fire began to study the radar pulses of SAM batteries, searching for patterns, flying lower, faster, gambling with every sortie, but clawing back fragments of control. What had been arrogance turned into grim adaptation, the kind that comes only when survival hangs in the balance. On the ground, soldiers traded stories of what they had seen. "They fight differently this time," muttered one lieutenant, blood still seeping through a bandage on his arm. "Not like 67. They're disciplined, trained. We underestimated them all." The words were bitter, but also clarifying. The war was no longer about proving superiority. It was about staying alive long enough to turn the tide. Back in the war cabinet, arguments raged into the early hours. Some urged bold strikes across the canal to cut off Egyptian advances before they consolidated. Others warned that such a move would be suicide, given the wall of SAMs and anti-tank weapons. The memory of hubris in the days before the war still stung, making every choice feel poisoned. At one point, the room fell into a heavy silence, as the defense minister spoke of the unthinkable, that Israel might not endure if the lines did not hold. Outside, the streets were empty, but in bomb shelters families whispered prayers, their ears tuned to the distant thud of artillery. The home front felt the tremors of decisions being weighed in secret, decisions that could tilt history itself. And yet, cracks began to show, not only in Israel, but across the canal. Intelligence pieced together from prisoners and fragments of intercepts suggested that Egyptian logistics were straining under the unexpected depth of their own success. Syrian units, overextended and battered, began to hesitate in the north. These were not opportunities yet, not openings to exploit, but they were glimmers, small reminders that wars are never static, that even the strongest offense breeds vulnerabilities. The question was whether Israel could see them in time and whether it dared to act before those glimmers vanished. As dawn bled into another day, a thin window appeared on the horizon, not yet wide enough to step through, but too dangerous to ignore. Somewhere near the canal, Egyptian positions showed signs of fatigue, coordination lagging, gaps opening between advancing brigades. For the first time, commanders whispered about something other than holding. They spoke of striking back, of seizing back initiative by inches. It was reckless, it was premature, and yet the idea refused to die. The nation that had stumbled into this war blind now stared at the canal and wondered if the very blindness might, paradoxically, become a weapon. Because no one expected Israel, broken and battered, to gamble again so soon. And so, the whispers grew louder. The possibility of a countermove, a desperate gamble, began to take shape. No one could yet say whether it would be salvation or final ruin. But as the War Cabinet adjourned, its members stepping into the gray light of morning, one fact had become undeniable. The war was no longer simply about survival. It was about clawing back destiny, inch by inch, with nothing guaranteed except the cost. And at the canal, a narrow window was opening, daring them to leap through it before it slammed shut. The night was black except for the restless sky, where magnesium flares hung and sank like dying stars, and across the water the sound of cables straining against the Nile's current told a story more terrifying than silence. A battlefield in chaos can often be described with noise, gunfire, explosions, orders shouted hoarse. But on the west bank of the Suez Canal in October 1973, it was the sound of engineering, of metal against water, of pontoons dragged into place under enemy fire, that announced the moment when the war stopped being purely defensive and became something far more dangerous. This was the hour when the army of Israel, bruised and half broken by surprise, decided to gamble everything by crossing into the enemy's depth. It was the hour when a war that had begun with intelligence failure and political blindness crossed into the realm of maneuver, deception, and counterstroke. And it was the hour when victory and catastrophe became indistinguishable until the very last move was made. The commanders who gathered over their tank hull maps that night knew they were stepping through a mirror. They had spent the first days of the war struggling to hold the line, fighting inch by inch to keep Egypt from bursting deep into Sinai and Syria, from smashing across the Golan Heights. Now the order shifted. They would not only stop the enemy, they would encircle him. The decision to cross at the Chinese farm sector of the canal, named for irrigation equipment built by a Japanese company, but mistranslated into Hebrew and Arabic, was as audacious as it was terrifying. For the men tasked with doing it, the ground itself seemed cursed. It was swampy, cluttered with irrigation canals, dug-in Egyptian infantry and anti-tank missile teams that had already destroyed wave after wave of Israeli armor. Survivors described it later as a place where the sand itself burned, where night did not conceal you, and where the air felt heavy with a presence that made death less an abstraction and more a certainty. Yet it was precisely here, amid that nightmare of mud and ambush, that the countermove would begin. Soldiers remember the eerie intimacy of that night, engineers whispering as they lashed bridge sections together, Tank commanders crouched over crumpled maps spread across engine decks, the sudden burst of a flare revealing faces that looked more like ghosts than men. Every sound seemed magnified: the slap of water, the squeal of cables, the distant thud of artillery probing in the dark. One officer later said that the canal seemed less like a body of water and more like a mirror, reflecting back not the enemy on the far bank, but their own fear. Crossing it meant stepping into uncertainty so total it felt like a second world. Still, they crossed, tank after tank rumbling onto makeshift bridges, infantry ferried across on rubber boats, radios crackling with code words and half-understood orders. Behind this maneuver was a desperate attempt at deception. Israeli SIGINT units had been retasked to simulate false communications, suggesting that the crossing would take place elsewhere, while human officers interrogated captured Egyptian soldiers in hurried, whispered exchanges, looking for any hint of where the Egyptians thought the strike might come. POWs spoke of commanders warning that the Israelis might attempt a crossing north of the Bitter Lakes, or that paratroopers might drop behind lines at Ismailia. The more uncertainty, the better. Deception was not about convincing the enemy of one truth, but of many possible truths, so that the actual one went unnoticed until it was too late. Radios sputtered phantom commands, tanks feinted movements they never intended to carry through, and patrols staged noisy firefights miles from the real crossing point. For the men living it, however, deception meant little. They measured the night by the dead and the living, by the tanks that made it onto the bridge, and those that never did. Survivors spoke later of comrades burning inside armored hulls, of stretcher-bearers who carried the wounded only to fall themselves, of young reservists murmuring the Shema as they pulled boat ropes through the canal's oil-slicked water. The Chinese farm became a graveyard as much as a battlefield. Yet, out of that graveyard, the bridgehead was established. Israeli tanks rolled onto the west bank, and suddenly the map changed. The Egyptian Third Army, which only days earlier had surged forward with confidence, was now at risk of encirclement. The change was not only geographical, but psychological. The army that had begun the war in shock now remembered its own capacity for maneuver, and the very act of crossing became a kind of exorcism. Commanders who had cursed intelligence officers for blindness now found themselves improvising new intelligence on the fly. Battlefield SIGINT units intercepted frantic Egyptian calls for reinforcements, while low-level scouts radioed back precise artillery coordinates drawn from the very chaos around them. Soldiers captured in the crossing provided information about supply lines, about the positioning of Egyptian missile batteries, about morale cracking under pressure. One prisoner muttered through cracked lips, "They told us you would never dare cross. They told us you were finished." For an Israeli colonel, that single line became more than testimony. It was evidence that the mirror was truly being shattered. On the Golan Heights, meanwhile, the reversal had already begun to take a different shape. Israeli forces that had once fought with their backs to the wall now pushed north, their tanks driving Syrian divisions back toward the approaches of Damascus. Every kilometer gained on that rocky plateau reshaped not only the battlefield, but the diplomatic clock. Reports filtered into Washington and Moscow alike. Damascus might soon be within artillery range. For Kissinger, who conducted his phone diplomacy in Washington with one eye on Soviet reactions, the danger was clear. A push too far could collapse diplomacy into confrontation, yet holding back could mean allowing the war to rage unchecked. The battlefield and the negotiating table were now fused, every move mirrored by political consequence. Yet, for those at the front, the language was not diplomacy, but survival. On the Golan, crews who had survived days of ceaseless anti-tank ambushes now advanced into villages stripped bare, past fields where destroyed armor still smoked. Survivors described the smell: burnt oil, flesh, pine trees charred to stumps, as something that lodged itself into memory deeper than sight or sound. Still, they pressed on, knowing that each kilometer pushed the Syrians closer to panic and brought Damascus itself into danger. Some spoke later of the strange dissonance. Advancing with grim triumph, while still grieving friends lost in the opening shock. As one officer muttered to himself, "We are fighting with ghosts in the tank beside us." For intelligence officers, this phase of the war was a brutal but necessary education. The failure of the pre-war picture forced them to relearn their craft in real time. Humor that might once have been sifted leisurely in headquarters was now gathered on the battlefield, from hurried interrogations in burnt-out farmhouses, from letters and diaries taken off the dead, from radio intercepts captured by mobile SIGINT teams crouched in jeeps on the edge of the canal. Analysts who had once dismissed red teaming as academic now did it in real time, sketching enemy courses of action on torn scraps of map paper, cross-checking with any fragment of evidence. Every assumption was suspect, every conclusion provisional. If the early days of the war had been defined by blindness, these nights were defined by a kind of furious, painful sight, blurry, contested, but no longer absent. The encirclement that began to form on the canal's west bank was not secure, and commanders knew it. Egyptian counterattacks lashed at the bridgehead, artillery pounded the pontoon crossings, and airstrikes turned sections of the river into boiling water. Each night, the cables groaned under the weight of tanks rumbling across. Each day, the bridges threatened to break apart under shell fire. More than once, engineers swam beneath the pontoons with ropes in their teeth, trying to patch breaks while bullets stitched the surface of the water above them. Each time the bridge held, it felt like a reprieve wrested by inches. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the war cabinet wrestled with choices that grew heavier by the hour. They knew that the encirclement, if achieved, could alter the war's entire trajectory. But they also knew that one misstep could leave their forces stranded on the wrong side of the canal, cut off and annihilated. Diplomacy pressed down harder now. American resupply flights thundered into Israel's airfields, crates of ammunition and spare parts disgorged under floodlights, while Kissinger's phone lines to both Jerusalem and Moscow ran hot with warnings and reassurances. Washington wanted Israel strong enough to survive, but not reckless enough to humiliate Egypt beyond repair. Every mile gained threatened to collapse that balance. And yet, soldiers in the mud of the canal had no time for balance. For them, the only truth was that the war which had begun with disaster now offered a chance, however fragile, at reversal. Survivors of the crossing spoke later of the moment dawn broke, and they realized they were alive on the far bank. The air smelled of cordite and rot. The water behind them still shivered with artillery splashes. But the fact remained. They had crossed. For a brief, impossible instant, it felt like history itself had tilted. Still, the mirror cut both ways. The same maps that showed Egyptian encirclement also showed Israeli overextension. The same radios that carried news of victory carried desperate pleas for reinforcement. A commander studying his maps under the trembling light of a tank headlamp could see two futures superimposed, one of triumph, with the Egyptian Third Army trapped and helpless, and one of catastrophe, with Israeli forces stranded and destroyed. The uncertainty was not merely tactical, but existential, and it grew heavier with each hour. The war had moved into a phase where victory and disaster were indistinguishable until the last line was drawn. Intelligence officers whispered that the hardest lesson had been learned too late. Wars punish stories, and the only truth is the one earned in blood and uncertainty. Soldiers who had survived the crossing into the mirror knew it in their bones. They also knew that the next move, one decision, one counterattack, one negotiation, could turn the fragile bridgehead into either salvation or annihilation. And so the war teetered, poised between triumph and ruin as the map stretched taut across tank holes under a sky scarred by flares. The bridge was holding, the encirclement tightening, the Golan pushing toward Damascus. But even as those victories took shape, new dangers pressed from every direction, and the question that hung over commanders, spies, and soldiers alike was brutal in its simplicity. Would they step out of the mirror with a nation saved, or vanish into it with nothing but ghosts left to testify? They thought the guns had fallen silent, that the earth itself might finally stop trembling under steel treads. that maps might at last stay fixed instead of bleeding red arrows across their paper skin. But even in that uneasy quiet, a different kind of battle began. One fought not with shells or tanks, but with words sharpened like knives and questions that cut deeper than shrapnel. Behind closed doors, in narrow rooms where the air carried the stale weight of tobacco and secrecy, men and women were summoned to account for the blindness that nearly broke a nation. And as those doors shut, the outside world could only guess at what was unraveling within, a reckoning of institutions, of doctrines, of the fragile assumptions that had guided them straight into catastrophe. The war had shown how quickly confidence could collapse when reality refused to conform, and now the hunt for causes, the demand for names, turned inwards, toward the very guardians who had promised to foresee the storm and had failed. The Agranat Commission sat like a tribunal of shadowed faces, its mandate wrapped in urgency and humiliation. Witnesses filed in, some clutching notes, others clinging only to memory, but all carrying the heavy knowledge that words here could end careers, reputations, entire legacies. Testimonies unspooled in monotone voices that barely masked their undercurrents of guilt and deflection. Memos stamped in urgent black, top secret, for eyes only, were lifted from folders, their lines read aloud with the finality of epitaphs. Each page documented not just intelligence assessments, but the architecture of a belief system that had calcified into dogma. One official admitted, almost with relief, that the Egyptians could not possibly cross in force because such a thought had been filed under impossible. Another insisted that the Syrians' deployments were defensive until the morning tanks were already grinding southward. And in every exchange, the Commission's members circled back to the same unspoken terror, that the guardians of foresight had spent years staring into the abyss, only to misname its shadow when it finally surged forward. Outside those sealed chambers, the soldiers who had crawled out of burning armor and trudged back from the desert's black smoke listened to rumors of the hearings with a bitter edge. For them, the reckoning had already been written in fire. The friends left unburied in Sinai, the unmarked graves near the canal, the burned-out hulks that still dotted the sand, these were the Commission's true archive. Yet it was not grief alone that haunted them, but the suspicion that the system designed to protect them had been too proud to imagine being wrong. One young officer, interviewed later, remembered thinking that the enemy he faced on the battlefield was no worse than the blindness of the maps pinned on headquarters walls. The artillery he could endure, the silence from those who should have known better, left the deeper scar. The Commission pressed on. Names were whispered, then spoken aloud, and then inscribed into final reports with devastating clarity. The chain of failure stretched across branches, but the heaviest weight fell on Amman, the military intelligence directorate that had claimed the primacy of interpretation. Its analysts had leaned too heavily on a single human source, an informant whose access was dazzling, but whose reliability was never fully tested under pressure. Dependent on that flow, they dismissed contradictory signals as noise, even as enemy divisions crept forward. Pride had fused with certainty, and certainty had hardened into blindness. Mossad, too, could not escape the echo of blame, its warnings diluted in the interagency struggle for authority. The question was no longer whether there had been data pointing to war, but why the structure built to catch it had decided not to believe. Closed-door testimonies revealed a doctrine so rigid it suffocated doubt. The conceptia, as it was called, rested on the conviction that the Arabs would not initiate a full-scale war without first achieving air parity, a condition they plainly had not reached. This assumption became more than an assessment. It was treated as a law of physics. Every new piece of evidence was bent to fit it, every voice of caution sidelined. When analysts raised alarms that the very absence of air parity might itself drive desperation, their arguments were filed under unlikely. The Commission's transcripts later read like a litany of warnings drowned by the louder hum of certainty. And within those rooms, even the generals themselves seemed to realize that their greatest enemy had not been Egyptian or Syrian deception, but their own refusal to imagine what they did not want to see. For those who had survived the Chinese farm nightmare or the armored infernos on the Golan, hearing these revelations in fragments was like reopening wounds. Families of the fallen demanded accountability, their voices echoing through parliament corridors and in bitter editorials that refused to fade. They asked who had decided that their sons would be caught unprepared, who had written the assessments that lulled the country into a false calm until the morning it shattered. But the answers came wrapped in evasions and partial admissions, as if language itself was another form of armor. And yet, amid all the denials, there was one quiet, almost unremarkable statement from a mid-level officer that carried the weight of final judgment. The enemy was not only across the canal, he said, the enemy was also in our mind. That single line struck deeper than the pages of testimony that surrounded it. It captured in its simplicity the tragedy of systems that mistake doctrine for reality, that confuse analysis with prophecy. The Agranat Commission would go on to issue recommendations, stripping authority from those deemed culpable, reshaping command structures, demanding reforms. Careers ended overnight. Generals who had been icons found themselves stepping into forced retirement. The humiliation was not confined to individuals, but spread across the very institutions that had built the myth of invincibility. Amman was told to yield its monopoly, to allow dissenting voices to be heard, to embrace red team cells tasked with breaking assumptions rather than enshrining them. Cross-agency fusion centers were ordered, where data from SIGINT, HUMINT, and aerial reconnaissance would be tested against each other without a single doctrine to silence the contradictions. Warning thresholds were rewritten, emphasizing that even low-probability signals could not be dismissed without exhaustive review. And new rules were drawn to protect human sources from being over-relied upon, their whispers treated as clues, but never as oracles. It was a structural diagnosis written in the language of bureaucracy, but born of blood. To the public, only fragments were known. The most damning lines of testimony remained classified, locked away in cabinets marked with seals that would not be broken for decades. Yet, the very secrecy of those pages added to their power, for the imagination filled in what the redacted ink refused to show. Every rumor of a shouted exchange, of a crumpled memo waved in frustration, of a career ended with a single phrase, became part of the national memory of failure. The myth of omniscience, once so carefully cultivated, was shattered, and in its place grew a new culture of suspicion. Suspicion not only of the enemy, but of one's own guardians of foresight. But reckonings are never confined neatly to commissions or reports. Their echoes move forward in time, resurfacing when least expected. In the years after the war, reforms hardened into routines, and younger officers were trained to question, to doubt, to imagine even the unlikely. Yet, alongside those new structures ran older undercurrents of secrecy and rivalry. And somewhere, in a file mislaid or in a conversation overheard, a name leaked from where it should have remained buried. That name carried with it threads of deception and betrayal, threads that years later would stretch all the way to a London balcony, where a man whose life had been lived in shadows would fall to his death, his final descent traced back not to a battlefield, but to the failures of a system that once refused to imagine being wrong. And so, the reckoning lingered, both as a lesson and a warning, that wars end at ceasefires, but their true conclusions are written only when nations face themselves in the mirror. In 1973, the reflection was brutal, unforgiving, and unforgettable. The systems that had promised safety had failed, and in that failure, a generation learned that vigilance without humility is blindness dressed in uniform. The file cabinets had long been closed, the commission reports published, the careers ended, and yet the shadow that haunted all of it refused to be buried. It was not written in the Agranat Commission's pages or the memoranda stamped top secret that sat gathering dust in archives. It moved instead in whispers, in half-sentences spoken at reunions of retired officers, in lines redacted from cables, in phone calls made across continents with pauses longer than the words themselves. And at the center of it stood one man whose name had been both salvation and damnation, whose very existence forced everyone to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. If the source was perfect, why did the warning fail? Ashraf Marwan had been called many things: the angel, the son-in-law of Nasser, the secret channel, the friend who saved Israel from annihilation, the traitor who lured them into complacency, the double-faced agent who played on both sides of the canal. He existed in the strange twilight of history, where documents contradict, memories fracture, and the truth itself seems to flicker like a faulty light bulb. On the one hand, his phone call on the eve of Yom Kippur had jolted Israel awake, his voice urgent enough to cut through the arrogance that had blinded the system. On the other, the timing of that call, the last possible hour before war, was so suspicious, so conveniently late, that it left behind a bitter taste that never faded. Some swore he had been Egypt's gift, others that he had been Egypt's trap, and the most honest simply admitted they could no longer tell the difference. In London, years later, long after the ceasefire and the reshuffled leadership, Marwan's life carried on in a haze of wealth, diplomacy, and private deals. He moved in glittering circles, rubbing shoulders with tycoons and arms dealers, slipping effortlessly into the salons of the powerful. But the shadow of 1973 followed him everywhere, not in the form of enemies across the canal, but in the endless suspicion of those who had once relied on him. The Mossad had defended him in whispers, certain that without him the catastrophe would have been worse. Military intelligence continued to doubt, their careers forever scarred by the sense that his assurances had left them blind. The Egyptians, for their part, spoke of him sometimes as a hero and sometimes as a snake, never with certainty, always with the bitter ambiguity that surrounds those who live too close to the fire of secrets. It should have ended as it does for most spies, with old age and silence, but it did not. On a summer day in 2007, in a London neighborhood far from the desert battlefields that had defined him, Ashraf Marwan was found lying on the pavement beneath the balcony of his apartment. He had fallen, or been pushed, from the 5th floor. There were no witnesses who saw the exact moment, only the aftermath, the body, the shock, the questions that would never be resolved. The British police treated it as unexplained. The Israelis and Egyptians each muttered their own conclusions. Some said he had jumped, overwhelmed at last by the weight of his double life. Others insisted he had been silenced, that someone, somewhere, had decided the story had become too dangerous to leave alive. In the end, his death was exactly like his life, shrouded in uncertainty, contested from every angle, impossible to pin down. But his story was never just his own. It was the mirror through which intelligence communities worldwide would study their own failures and their own illusions. The reckoning that followed the Yom Kippur War had not stayed in Israel. It traveled, carried into military academies, intelligence schools, and national security councils across the globe. Americans would return to it after Pearl Harbor, trying to understand how they had once misread the Japanese signals. They would revisit it again after September 11th, staring at the same pattern of warnings dismissed, of structures too rigid to allow imagination, of data suffocated by doctrine. Years later, as tanks rolled across Ukraine and Western capitals, debated whether the signals had been clear, some analysts pulled dusty volumes from their shelves and found themselves reading about 1973, as if the ghost of the angel was still whispering through the pages. If the source was perfect, why did the warning fail? It was the question that refused to die, because it was not really about one man or one war. It was about the human mind, about how certainty can be the most dangerous narcotic of all, about how systems built to see everything can still be blinded by their own confidence. Every time the question was asked, Marwan's name was spoken, but it was not his answer people were after. It was their own. In Israel, every Yom Kippur is still heavy with that memory. At 2 o'clock, as the prayers rise in synagogues and the streets fall silent, some cannot help but hear an echo that doesn't fade. The sirens of 1973, the rush of soldiers into tanks, the mothers holding their children in doorways, the stunned disbelief that the unimaginable had come to pass. Silence, prayer, sirens, then silence again. It is a rhythm etched into the national soul, a reminder that the enemy was never only across the canal. The enemy sat in the mind, in the refusal to believe that what one fears most can still be true. Marwan's shadow still lingers in those moments. Some see him as the man who saved Israel from a complete catastrophe, whose warning, late though it was, allowed the reserves to be mobilized, the planes to be scrambled, the counteroffensive to be mounted. Others see him as the man who set the trap, whose reassurances and carefully timed alert lured Israel into a false sense of security that cost thousands of lives. Both views are true, and neither is complete, because the truth itself refuses to sit still. It dances just beyond reach, as elusive now as it was when he first walked into a meeting room offering secrets in exchange for trust. What endures is not the certainty of who he was, but the lesson of what his story revealed. Intelligence does not defeat surprise. Humility does. The willingness to imagine the worst, to question the most trusted source, to accept that the enemy can be cleverer than the doctrine allows. That is the real shield. And yet, time and again, nations forget. They build new systems, design new safeguards, promise themselves they will never again be caught off guard. But history has a cruel rhythm. The second hand circles back, the warnings come, the doubts are dismissed, and once more the silence before the sirens is broken too late. And so, the angel remains in the shadows, not as a man, but as a parable. His life ended on a London pavement, but his story continues, wherever leaders convince themselves that they cannot be surprised. The shadow falls across Washington and Moscow, across Cairo and Jerusalem, across every capital where men and women believe their systems are too strong to fail. In that shadow lies the quiet reminder that no system is immune, no doctrine eternal, no certainty safe. On Yom Kippur, the clock ticks again towards 2 in the afternoon. Somewhere, an old soldier closes his eyes and hears the sound of sirens from half a century ago. Somewhere else, a young analyst stares at a screen, convinced that the dots she sees cannot possibly mean what they appear to mean. The rhythm repeats: silence, prayer, sirens, silence. And in the silence afterward, the angel's shadow lingers. The second hand lands on 2 o'clock one last time, and then at last it fades. The silence after the war never really ended. For Israel, for Egypt, for the intelligence world, it echoed through the decades. Ashraf Marwan's shadow stretched further than any battlefield, haunting every conference room where analysts stared at reports, wondering what was true and what was bait. His file became a parable, taught in Mossad briefings, whispered in CIA corridors, dissected in MI6 seminars. The perfect source who failed to prevent the perfect surprise. Was it his fault or theirs for believing too completely? No one agreed, but everyone remembered. When towers fell in New York in 2001, the same word surfaced again: failure of imagination. When tanks rolled across Ukraine's borders in 2022, generals quoted 1973, pointing out how warnings sat on desks but weren't acted upon until it was too late. History didn't repeat itself, but it rhymed with the same fatal beat. And yet, Marwan's story was not finished even in death. In 2007, his body lay broken on the pavement beneath a London balcony. Officially, he had fallen. Unofficially, few believed accidents happen to men who live entire lives in shadows. Was it the Egyptians silencing a traitor? The Israelis protecting a secret? Or simply gravity claiming a man who had lived too long between truths? His last act was the same as his life: unresolved. In the end, the Yom Kippur War left more than casualties, and borders shifted. It left a lesson etched into every intelligence service that studied it. Technology, spies, satellites, none of them erase the oldest enemy: certainty. The belief that what you know is enough, the comfort of assumptions, the arrogance of being sure. Intelligence doesn't defeat surprise, humility does. And as the years stretch on, the clock in memory still points to 2 p.m. on October 6th, 1973. The sirens have long since faded, the prayers ended, the guns silenced. Only the silence remains, carrying the shadow of the angel who warned, the generals who doubted, and the war that taught the world how fragile knowing can be.